And the scenarios that we had discussed over that time was one that would kick off 2020 and a new decade with a lot of excitement and commitment to sustainable development goals, and importantly, focusing on equitable growth around the continent, and specifically in emerging markets and developing economies as well. And don't forget that it's a momentum that there was a vision to continue this that had been carrying on for around 2 decades. And that growth we had seen put a significant dent in priority areas like poverty reduction as well as life expectancy. But the pandemic has not only derailed those plans, but also accentuated the existing vulnerabilities, and it's reversed some of the gains that we've made, resulting in heartbreaking inequalities that have been on the rise, specifically in developed economies and developing economies as well. It's also reopened economic and social wounds, scars that were susceptible to shocks. And here we are today. We're looking forward to 2021. And it comes with a bit of hope. Vaccines are on the cusp of global distribution. It's a potential turning point. So will developing economies and countries reach that turning point as well? What are the policies that can prevent the gap from widening and getting developing economies back on the path to equitable growth? I'd like to welcome our very special guest today, and I'm in incredible company. I'm very honored to welcome the MD of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, Nyaranzai Gumbo Njanda, Chair of ActionAid International, human rights lawyer and CEO of Rosario Memorial Trust, Honorable Amadou Hott, the Minister of Economy for Senegal, and Nobel Prize-winning economist Michael Kremer from the University of Chicago. A welcome to all of you. I wish I could see you in person, MD. I'm glad that I got to meet with you this time last year. And what a change and difference it's been. I mean, reflecting back on the conversation that we had back then to where we are today, we're talking now about scars, and we're talking about healing those scars. What would you say the biggest wounds are of the pandemic for low-income and developing economies?
It is indeed a very different time that we meet virtually, and it is so critically important to zero on the issues for the developing world. Why? Because what we see from this pandemic is a very clear danger of reversing some of the trends that we cheered when you and I met. We are seeing the dramatic impact on growth prospects in the developing world stemming from this pandemic. In fact, the health tragedy, as terrible as it is, may be even overtaken by the economic scars from the pandemic. And we see reversal in poverty, hunger, something that is absolutely unacceptable. So let me focus on 3 things. One, the criticality of returning to growth. Africa, this year, 2020, will finish with 3% smaller economy. It will shrink. And this is bad. Even worse, in my view, is that next year we are projecting the world economy to grow 5.2%, Africa only slightly over 3%. Africa has to grow 6, 7, 8, 9, as Senegal has been doing over the last decades. By the way, Senegal is a wonderful exception because this 2020, it will finish with positive growth, one of the very few countries globally to do so. And that takes me to my second point. We have to recognize that those that are withstanding this shock better do so because they built strong fundamentals before. The same way people with weak immune systems are hit by the pandemic more severely, economies with underlying vulnerabilities suffer more from the economic crisis. And that means we need to build these fundamentals. 3, it is absolutely paramount to recognize the importance of supporting developing countries much more strongly in the year to come. Why? And I'll give you numbers, and they're pretty shocking. What we saw is that advanced economies in this crisis adopted the famous Mario Draghi, whatever it takes. They put 20% to their GDP in policy actions to support their economies. Emerging markets, 6%. Low-income countries, 2%. But behind these percentages, if you take the absolute numbers, breaks my heart. Absolute numbers in advanced economies, $9.8 trillion, almost $10 trillion. Absolute numbers in low-income countries, $40 billion. This is 245 times less. Now, we have done, at the IMF, we have leaned forward. Actually, out of this 40 billion, a big chunk comes from emergency financing from the IMF. And what I want to call on everybody is that we have to be determined. There is urgency to support low-income countries, so we prevent the scars from being deep and possibly leading to irreversible shift in trends. And as we do so, one particular issue we have to put to our hearts, and it is investing in people, investing in health, investing in education, investing in social protection. And I give you my word that the IMF will be prioritizing the resilience of people on equal footing as resilience of the financial system and the economy as such. I'm sorry to dwell on that, but I'm thinking of all the kids that are now out of school. If you are in an advanced economy, my granddaughter, she goes to virtual school every single day. If you are in an African country and there is no access to the internet, and more than 50% are in this situation, the kid is out of school, scarring for forever, year lost. And we know that next year, when kids start coming back, boys are more likely to go back to school than girls. So gender equality can get a dent. And this is why I speak from the bottom of my heart. We have urgency to act to zero on the needs of the developing world.
Thank you so much, MD. And I completely concur with you. I think that the vulnerabilities that exist between emerging economies, low-income countries, and advanced economies are specifically highlighted and perhaps manifested in the way that the children have been impacted. And Yaranzai, I'm going to jump to you on this because the MD ended on this point, and I think it's so vital. Looking at kids out of school, looking at the impact on women and children, this pandemic has reversed so many gains. And I know that this is a topic that's very close to your heart as a human rights lawyer, as someone that, is even advising the IMF on some of the things you're seeing on the ground. Tell me about the situation right now when it comes to the vulnerable communities, because these are actually at the heart of what we should be focusing on, as the MD says.
Thank you so much. It was heartwarming to hear the MD Kristalina talk about resilience of people, and it's about people, it's about systems, it's about the economy. When we talk of healing the scars, for me and the work I do in the villages, in the communities across the continent, the scars are losing lives, really bearing people to COVID. It's the risk of the high numbers of morbidity around the world. It's a real life situation of losing lives and people who are not able to get access to treatment. It's about how ordinary women mostly have struggled with the impact of COVID-19. So the critical issue for me on the crisis at hand has been how COVID-19 has impacted women as workers, that when COVID hit and we went into a recession, women were already in fragile jobs. And the frontline workers are the majority of women. It means they are also at high risk, even when we look at the health workforce. The second critical category that has been hit so much as women is women as producers and market women. We know that we as women in the villages, the women farmers were not able to take their foods to their crops to the market, and the markets were frozen. So the whole issue of livelihoods became a critical issue. Women as caregivers, the healthcare systems are fractured. And when we heard about self-isolation at home, it reminded us of the HIV pandemic, which was about home-based care. It means the public health sector was transferring responsibility to the household and to the woman as the caregiver. And in addition to all that is the crisis of the adolescent girls. Definitely the data is telling. GPE has given us the data of the 24 million who may not be able to access education, and teenage pregnancy, child marriage data I have every day as AU Goodwill Ambassador on ending child marriage. The crisis demands us to re-recognize that the greatest existing precondition that is making the situation work is gender inequalities. And UN Women has said, this COVID-19 is taking us back 25 years of the gains that we've made. And we had the Central Bank Governor of Kenya talk of the SDG. So this is a huge loss. It demands courage. It demands us to look into opportunities that exist, but definitely women are not on the table of the COVID response. Women are not on the table of the economic recovery. Women are not on the table at all levels. So it's great to also see that we need to continue to build that critical mass. The scars are painful. In this ActionAid, we are just bearing our own Soren, who has been so much involved in this response. And today, it's yet a reminder that healing the scars is about people, systems, and the economy.
Thank you very much. Honorable Minister Hart, great to speak to you again, great to engage with you again. So you've heard from the MD saying building resilient economies is vital. MD, I know that South Africa, where I'm right now, we did not take that advice, but this is why we're in trouble. Senegal, however, has been on a growth path, and you've been very firmly focused on building sustainable and equitable growth. I want to talk about how you have taken into consideration some of the vital points that Nyanzai spoke about, that keeping people in the heart of what you do, of the agenda of how you spend. And it's so hard because you've got to reconcile the numbers, the budgets, the lack of funding, the lack of money, a slowdown in economic growth, with the realities of how people are experiencing and kind of experiencing the harshities and the negativities of the pandemic. How do you do this? How have you done this?
Thank you, Eleni. It's good to see you again. Kristalina, good to see you as well virtually. Abdullahi of Finance and Budget sends his regards as well. First of all, I'd like to thank the IMF for convening this important panel this afternoon here in Senegal. And I wanted to also say that early in March, when the pandemic started, we took very quick measures under the leadership of President Macky Sall to put in place a social and economic resilience program to help the health system, to help the most vulnerable people here in the country, but also in our diaspora, to help our companies, to help all the sectors that were in trouble. And the program constituted about 7% of our GDP, about 1 trillion Senegalese CFA. And one of the second pillar of this program is the support of low-income households, to make sure that about 1.1 million households are receiving food help, but also the government is helping them pay their electricity bills, helping them pay also water bills, but also send money to Senegalese overseas, because we receive about 12% of our GDP coming from our diaspora, and many of them also were stuck outside of Senegal, so we had to send them money. So we constituted a fund that we call a Force COVID-19, and we spoke to our partners all the donors contributed. And I want to pause here and especially thank the IMF for the swift reaction and the massive reaction, because all the funds we received from our partners, the IMF contribution was at least 1/3. And it came within 2 weeks of the country finalizing the program, and it was really, right there. And it was so fast that I said, maybe all the donors in doing projects or programs, we should replicate that fast-track way of dispersing really help when it is needed. And the government also took the decision to freeze many actually expenses, like missions, because nobody was traveling anymore, staff training, conferences, seminars. So our sort of recurrent expenditure, we cut it down, number one. Number two, we said that investment projects that were not a priority, we should postpone them, let's say, to coming years and use that budget allocation to face this pandemic. So we had to increase our budget. We had to double our budget deficit. We were planning to be at -3%. We ended up being at -6.1% to finance the fact that we have more expenses, the fact that also our domestic resource also has come down because of the economic impact of this pandemic. So this is really what we're trying to do. And then we passed a new bill, a supplementary bill on the budget, so that we are allowed to spend all that money. And we are glad that after that intervention, about 97-95% of the population that we consulted, the people that were helped, most of them, 97%, were happy with the government's intervention. And thanks to our efforts, but the efforts of our partners as well, including the IMF.
Minister, very quickly, just on the fact that debt repayments have been halted until the first half of 2021. How important was that in creating sustainable, start to the year?
It was important, but for Senegal, we didn't get it until later in the year, actually. Around September, I think, is when we, maybe August, when we signed with some of our partners, bilateral partners, but some actually we didn't sign because of some issues on the MOU. On the budget side, the impact was not very big because the interest part was not very big, but it was good that we got cheap funding, actually. Even if it started late, that's why we are very happy that the initiative is extended until June of next year. But we are pushing very hard, and with the help of Kristalina and all the G20 members, hopefully will extend it. It will be extended until end of the year. So for 2021, it's important for Senegal, and it's very important for many countries in Africa as well. And for now, it's more for low-income countries, but we've been pushing also for vulnerable middle-income countries to be able also to have this benefit, and hopefully that will be accepted, such as the likes of Kenya or like of Seychelles, or maybe others, Mauritius, that have been impacted, but who are not low-income countries, can maybe have some benefit from this initiative.
Mr. Kramer, I'd like to bring you in here, and I know that you've been looking at various scenarios that could play out in the next year and looking forward, but I want you to reflect back on this year. We have been unified by fighting the same problem globally, and that is a pandemic. But globally, we've seen different responses. We've seen COVID-19 rates playing out differently. Like for instance, here in South Africa, you have very high infection rates, but low death rates. But you've seen economic responses vary so significantly. What have you learned from leadership by way of the economic reactions and where we are today, and how that sets the tone for where we're going?
I think you're right that countries have responded in different ways to this, and that's partly because the epidemic has played out in different places, but it's also because of different policy responses. And I think one thing we've learned is that we need to try to have a smart policy response, and that means taking the actions that are going to be most effective against the epidemic with the least negative consequences for for the economy, but also, very importantly, as the managing director said, for investments in people. And really one of the tragedies of the pandemic has been the impacts on access to other routine healthcare, women no longer delivering babies in clinics, children not getting immunizations, kids coming out of school. So I think we're learning over time, and most countries are now, for example, allowing kids back in school, but not all countries are doing that. I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't want to, this is a decision for every country, but we may be able to take steps to try to ensure that the most essential services, educational and health services, can be restored, and so that we're not adopting counterproductive measures like stopping trucks on the road that are carrying food between the countryside and the city that create huge suffering for people and that are not really essential to the epidemic. Instead, we can focus on things like masks, banning, not having large gatherings indoors, things like that. Okay, but I think the other thing that I would really stress is one thing that's critically important, and I think will eventually get us out of this crisis, is vaccines. And the world has made substantial investments in vaccines, which is great. We were lucky in that it looks like a wide variety of vaccines are proving effective, more effective than we ever anticipated. Now, the plans that were made at a global level through COVAX, for example, were targeting perhaps 20% vaccination rates in high-income countries that bought vaccines for their entire population. For low-income countries, COVAX, they were targeting 20%. They don't even have the financing for that. We're lucky enough that we will have the capacity that we can go beyond that. If you got 20%, you can get the people who are at most medical risk. But we're in a position now where we can go beyond that, because if we want to get economic recovery, if we want to get recovery of social sectors like education, ordinary healthcare, we'll need to go substantially beyond that 20%. And that's now no longer an unachievable goal. So we have perhaps 10 billion doses online of capacity. That's enough for 5 billion people. That's assuming everything goes right, the remaining vaccines get approved. But we can actually, if we can accelerate this by putting in more capacity, we can actually speed the economic recovery. The IMF estimates are each month that goes by, $500 billion is lost. So it's worth, even if you're spending $1 billion to put in more capacity, that's worth, happy to share calculations for those who are interested. The other thing is we need to make sure we use the capacity we have. And that means since different vaccines are suited to different circumstances, some require extreme cold chains, some don't, since the prices are very different, we could set up exchange systems so that each country can make their own choices about what vaccines they want to prioritize and get access to them.
Thank you, sir. I would like to let the audience know that we are taking questions. We have a few that were sent prior to this conversation. I'll be getting to them in a short while. For those of you that still have a few questions to send us, you can go to menti.com and the code is 9106394. So please send those through. And MD, there's so much to talk about. So I'm going to try and whittle it down to the most important. I mean, Mr. Kremer was saying that vaccines are directly correlated to a resumption of economic growth and sustainable growth and the fact that we can get back to recovery. But that can only be done with the right amount of funding and thinking very carefully about how we do this with low-income countries. IMF is very committed in helping making that happen. But then you have the issue of a debt overhang, and that is really plaguing a lot of countries, and it's also dominating conversations.
I could not agree more with the panelists on what they have highlighted as priorities for action. And I want to get to your questions in the following order. First, to recognize that the best value for money today is to accelerate access to vaccines everywhere for everyone. If we want to see this crisis in the rearview mirror, that is absolutely paramount that we share resources and we move as fast as possible. To give you the aggregate number of what the IMF calculated, accelerated access to vaccines would mean it would provide a boost between 2020 and 2025 of $9 trillion. So we do it, and out of it, actually, emerging markets in developing countries would take about 40% of the benefit, and 60% would go to advanced economies. So if there has ever been a case of be generous, help everybody, this is the case. I admire the work that has been done with COVAX. The World Bank has made a $12 billion commitment. We will have to do more, and then we need to think about distribution and health systems. And I just want to say it is a unique opportunity as we concentrate on the vaccines to think more broadly about health systems and this human capital we are so concerned about. But then too, we need to recognize that we have this a narrow issue of vaccination, but we have the broader issue of getting emerging markets, developing economies on a faster growth path. And there you put the question of debt. I want to zero on it and then make one step further to access to financing. So on debt, David Malpass and I early in this crisis called for debt service suspension. It is so commonsensical that if the economy is in standstill, debt service should be in standstill. You can't extract money when the economy is not working. And if you do so, it would be at the cost of people dying. And I was so encouraged to see the G20 embracing this. We got the debt service suspension in place. And I agree with Minister Hoth that the crisis is not going to be over by June. So we have to be thinking about extending it for a bit longer. By the way, at the IMF, we took an early decision that for our poorest members, we should stop service of their debt to us. And actually, we went one step further. We got our better off countries to help us to de facto cancel this debt. So we have a grant mechanism for repayment. We have extended this until mid next year. And I can tell you already it's going to be extended until the end of 21. This is already saving these 29 poorest countries 500 million. This is $500 million of easing in space. Now, when we look into the future, we will have to recognize that for some countries, this suspension of service is going to be enough. They'll come back to growth, and they would be able to restart repayment. For countries where that is not sustainable, and unfortunately there is quite a number of these countries, this is not going to be enough. You kick the can down the road, but the can is so heavy that if you continue kicking, you'll break your foot. So we have to recognize the need of case by case debt restructuring that may also include debt reduction. And as the minister said, while we are concentrated, because we have the common framework for the countries, for the low-income countries on debt, we are concentrating on this category of countries. There are some emerging markets that are in a similarly difficult situation. In other words, low middle-income countries in that distress. We have seen restructuring for Argentina and Ecuador, and I would be the first to urge us to act early. It is not going to get better, it can only get worse. The earlier we front this issue, the better countries would be. And you will see the fund engaging very actively on a case-by-case basis to make sure that we bring that to sustainable level. But this is not going to be enough, and I would finish with one sentence here. We have to think about access to financing on a scale that is proportionate to the needs of countries to overcome this crisis. At the IMF, we are already working on a next generation of support to countries. The first generation emergency financing, we asked only for two things. We asked first for support to be provided to the most vulnerable people, most vulnerable parts of the economy, prioritize doctors and nurses. And two, we asked, keep the receipts. So spend, keep the receipts. By the way, today is International Anti-Corruption Day.
Oh,
keep
fantastic.
the receipts. It's a very important message.
Yeah,
I mean, for the next generation, we are going to look at fiscal policies, governance, and growth injecting policies.
You know what, when the IMF says we're asking for just a few things, I think all policymakers are like, okay, what do we need to do? And I have to just reiterate what Pakistan's Reserve Bank governor earlier said during this event. And he said, you know, when the IMF gives you a program, it actually comes with a lot of pain. And here I'm trying to reconcile the fact that the world, and you even mentioned, you know, developed economies, advanced economies are spending 20% of their GDP on spending their way out of this crisis, and low-income countries are spending a mere 2% of GDP. And then we're saying to low-income countries, you actually have to worry about your debt overhang. We've got to think about debt relief and debt restructuring, and you have to be even more prudent than most. MD, how do we reconcile this conversation? Because it's tough, and we have to have this conversation because policymakers are basically feeling very stuck.
So let me first say that as the first managing director from an emerging markets, when I talk about pain and gain, I am not reading it from a book. It is from experience. My own country, Bulgaria, in the mid-90s, went virtually bankrupt, hyperinflation, very painful period, and then worked with the IMF through these issues to build sound macroeconomic foundation. And today, Bulgaria is one of the most fiscally prudent countries in the European Union. It is kind of pain that you remember, you don't want it to be repeated ever. So my message to countries is, yes, working with us means concentrating on painful problems to be solved. We learned from experience that as we solve these problems, we do have to pay attention to the most vulnerable people. And this is why we put what we call social spending floor in our programs. We don't want to fall below. But we also recognize that strong macroeconomic fundamentals are paramount for success, to have vibrant economy and to have private sector participating. And we will continue to work with our membership for countries that are experiencing policy difficulties. We ought to overcome these difficulties. Where we are, I think we have been working with Pakistan. I have been talking to the Prime Minister, and we have tried to be accommodative in a way. In this particular time, we structure policies, but ultimately what we want are healthy economies with a resilience built across, and that I think you would see us in our next program interactions very much zeroing on a small number of critical issues. One, fiscal. Do countries have taxes that are being fairly distributed? The rich pay more. and that are actually collected. I mean, we can't have economies with tax to GDP below 10%. And I'm not going to name names, but we have those. We said it has to be at least 15% to GDP. If you want to have vibrant country, you have to do that. Then two, are we thinking about public investment that has long-term growth potential? Digitalization is going to be critical. Climate resilience, is agriculture resilient? And three, are we thinking about equality of opportunities, gender equality? Are we thinking about it? Is our thinking such that women are empowered to contribute to the economy? So it is. Let me put it this way: this is not your grandmother's or grandfather's IMF. We learned, and we are forward-leaning. We want to be an institution of choice for our membership, not of shame. that I know is that we still have work to do in that regard. We'll do it.
I get it. And I mean, as I said, there's still this correlation, IMF equals pain. But Minister Hott, you've just had a bit of experience in that. So I just... look, we've only got 20 minutes left and I have so many things to ask. So I'm going to jump straight into some of the audience questions, which is kind of what I also wanted to get into. And it's still on debt because I feel, and I really think, and perhaps you can tell me if, healing the scars of the pandemic, debt falls part of that. It's a scar that is going to be evident for all nations. And here's a question that came through. How long is Senegal able to sustain this recovery spending in terms of months? As on the other side of Senegal's debt servicing to private sector is some 45% of all debt servicing costs. So I know that you've been talking about whether the private sector, whether private creditors should also suspend repayments. But I also heard earlier today that if that is done, it kind of then puts into question, whether a country can pay back debt, and then you get excluded from capital markets. So then that creates a problem. So what is the fine balance here that you have to play on the macro front?
Thank you very much. As the MD said, the critical thing is to mobilize more domestic resources. In Senegal, we have a short-term strategy to increase our fiscal pressure from around 17 to 20% by 2023. And by widening the tax base, instead of taxing more those people who are already paying their taxes. So this is number one. It comes to helping the informal sector also formalize more. And these measures are part of our recovery program through the PAP2A, which is the second priority action plan of the government. On the issue of debt, Senegal has always said that the issue of having a DSSI for the private sector for commercial debt, it should be on a case-by-case basis. It should not be like on the official sector. And Senegal certainly doesn't need that, actually. One of the risks is that if you're forcing that situation, that scenario, you may actually increase the cost of debt for some countries that don't need actually that private sector DSSI, and also to reduce the tenors that we can get when we go to the Eurobond market, for example. So it's going to be a case by case. Some countries certainly needs that, and the common debt framework provides that when countries ask for that, you have some kind of same level treatment. That is understood, but again, it has to be on a case by case basis. And lastly, one of the best ways also to increase the domestic resource mobilization is to push more for private sector investments in the economy. Governments can invest, it's normal in big infrastructure and others, but you can also have PPP projects. That's why Senegal will pass the new PPP law, hopefully by end of this year. It's been just approved recently by a meeting. And so in that law, we are making things simple, transparent, and also taking into account the impact on the budget side as well, because the PPPs also can be very complex. We are setting up a special unit that will advise the government from the technical, financial structuring on the legal side as well, to make sure that the PPPs are balanced, that we don't take all the risk and the investor take all the returns. And we believe that moving more towards private sector investments is very, very critical going forward.
Thank you so much for that, Minister Nyaranzai. And again, I'd just say we are running out of time, so I want to get through as much as possible. We're talking about budget, we're talking about money, we're talking about debt. So that means squeezed budgets. How are you planning to mitigate the risk of tightening budgets, and what pressure is that putting on your efforts on the ground?
Thank you so much. I think for me...
Sorry, this is for Nyaranzai. Apologies, Minister.
Just building on the conversation from the Honorable Minister, I think for me, when we say budget are constrained, already it means there's a political choice and political decisions made, usually which cues out the social justice issues, which affects the communities and especially women more. So it's a question of political choice. With the little resources that are there, our governments must also continue to prioritize those issues. On the issues around tax, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. COVID-19 is a wonderful opportunity for tax reform. There's a lot of literature we can share around tax justice, the work that ActionAid has been doing. I think it's a fantastic opportunity that we have. I also liked the comment that the IMF we're looking at today and for tomorrow should not be our great-grandfather or great-grandmother IMF, which for me resonates with this is the opportunity not only to build back, because we don't want to build back on what was not working, but we want to build the future. And building that future should not take us back to the austerity measures that were hurting, especially the social sector, which impacts women and children more, the health and education sector. It should be building for the future that does not take us back to the structural adjustment experiences of cutting on payroll and all these issues, when actually this is where we need resources. But ultimately, the conversation on private sector should not be about big business. COVID has shown us that it's women who are producing liquid soap, sanitizers in the communities, who are also doing masks and who are innovating. So when we talk about investing in the private sector, I hope and believe that both our governments and the IMF are not looking at women's business as micro, but work that women do is also macro, as part of the mainstream, because there's nothing micro about women, market women in Africa who are actually sustaining households and families. So we need to be creative and find solutions where those market women become part of revitalizing our economy, in addition to building partnership with big business. Because otherwise we are going back to the past, where the thinking of what is business and private sector was actually mostly big men owning big shares in international corporations, and not the woman in the village who is protecting the environment, investing in climate justice work and agriculture. Thank you, Eleni.
I must say, it's a good thing we've got a Nobel Economic Laureate with us that can tell us if this is a viable economic solution to our problems. Mr. Kramer, are you able to weigh in here? I mean, look, it's not going to be the same. The world is not going to be the same. And I wonder if we are going to be operating differently and in the right way, and that vulnerable communities are going to have a stronger voice. And how do we empower them? Because that is one scar that exists. The inequalities have increased, they have been accentuated, and they are stark.
Yes, I think, when we've looked at the epidemic so far, we are seeing in many ways a K-shaped recovery. So if you look at I'll give some data from the United States, you look at people who are earning high incomes initially and people who are earning low incomes initially. In the short run, you saw big declines in employment, that in both groups. There was actually a very rapid recovery for those high earners initially. But the low earners, unemployment rates have recovered a little bit, but they're still very high. And I think that's something that we need to address as we pull out of the epidemic. Now, I do think, as I've emphasized, a key step is to get out of the epidemic, and one of the things that requires is distribution of vaccines. But I also think we need to think about what are the long-run changes that we'll see as a result of the epidemic. Here, I think I have a somewhat different take than some. We've made investments. Why did we get that recovery for high-income workers? Well, in part because we've restructured our work. Certainly, as a professor, I've restructured my work. I'm teaching online. I had to develop, probably not the best at it, but colleagues developed ways of teaching online. That requires restructuring how you teach. It requires technology investments. Those types of changes have taken place in sector after sector. Even this very conference that we're in now, this discussion is taking place online. That's happened for high-income people, but it hasn't happened as much for low-income people. And that's in part because the incentives of companies, there's plenty of incentive for Google and Facebook and so on to find ways of serving people who can pay for it. But I think...
So on that note, Mr. Kramer, we actually had a question from the audience that why isn't internet free? Why are we still discussing it at this point? And I think it speaks to what you're saying right now.
Well, I think that technology can also provide benefits throughout the income distribution, but we need investments to make that possible. I don't want to weigh in for sure on whether internet should be free, but let me give an example. Many people in low-income countries, they may not have smartphones that can use internet right now, but most people have phones. Well, they could be getting information on those phones, information that could be useful for agriculture. You can't go face-to-face to give agricultural extension advice right now, but you could give information on mobile phones, and that approach has been proven to be effective. You can't give classes online, and look, this is not a substitute in any way. This would just be around the margins. But there's evidence that if you do some outreach by phones, you can help avoid some of these educational losses that are happening right now. So I think we need to find ways, and those services could be free. The costs of this are actually extremely, extremely low. I would say that as we come out of this, many people are thinking that, well, we've had a huge reduction in international travel and ability to communicate around the world. And people think we're going to have a reduction in globalization as a result of this. I don't think that's what we're going to see at all. And here's maybe where I would depart from the conventional wisdom. We've invested in using technology to be able to communicate digitally. I don't see that in any way as a substitute for face-to-face interaction. I see that as a complement in the technical economic sense, just like coffee and sugar are complements, coffee and milk or tea and milk. Once you can start interacting face-to-face, then you can continue that interaction digitally or vice versa. So I think we're going to see actually an increase, because we can interact globally, because we can create broader networks now. This creates huge potential. We're going to see more globalization, more interaction. We just have to make sure that everybody can be a part of that.
Thank you. Minister Hart, this brings me to, when I hear what Mr. Kramer was talking about with regards to people working closely together, the continent is on the verge of one trading bloc, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is quite exciting because we've obviously derailed those plans. But listening to a more interconnected world, and technology has certainly kept us connected, it's kept us in the loop, and the continent has been leapfrogging older legacy technologies for quite some time now. How are you envisaging the next few years and how technology is going to play a role? I know that in your economic recovery plan, it does feature, and how are you thinking about an integrated Africa, a more integrated world?
Thank you. It will give us a lot of opportunities to trade with each other. We are already doing it, but the electronic commerce, the e-commerce has not developed yet that much amongst African countries, but we'll see probably some of that in the future. In Senegal, we've been working very fast to upgrade our ICT system. I think one of the best in West Africa, if not in Sub-Saharan Africa so far. with several programs that we are executing with the help of the World Bank and the African Development Bank. For example, to incentivize corporations, let's say, to pay their employees using electronic money instead of using cash, with the matching grants from the World Bank. With the African Development Bank building an ITCT park in Diamniadio, in the new city of Diamniadio, where we had this DET conference last year, and that park will help actually us attract ICT companies with all the infrastructure so that they don't have to invest in infrastructure. It will be readily made, and this is government investment, but that will be managed with the private sector. But one of the key projects we are trying to execute during this recovery plan is to have, the real postal addresses. Because today, when you want to ship something to someone's house, it's very complicated. You'll say, go to this building, there is a big tree, nearby, and then when you turn left, you can come to my house. But now we want to make sure that on the roads we have the numbers with the geolocalization, so that the e-commerce can really develop in our country. And on the African Continental Free Trade area, huge opportunity. For now, we are finalizing, let's say, implementing the freedom, let's say, of services, of moving services around and goods. And later, we'll make sure that also companies can invest in one country and export, let's say, their products and services, let's say, from Senegal as far as Zambia. That will be easier in the future, and I'm sure that will attract more FDIs in our countries. But at the same time, also, we got to make sure that countries are ready. You're not just becoming a kind of importing country. You have to take advantage of the situation and be able also to export so that it becomes a win-win for all.
Thank you, Minister. MD, we talk about 2021 being a turning point. Are you confident that it could be the turning point for developing economies? And what would you say is going to make that happen?
Well, it is up to us. What is the legacy we will leave from next year? We saw after the global financial crisis, the legacy is a strong banking system, and it is serving us very well today. The legacy of this crisis has to be more resilient societies. And more resilient world is not one in which the accordion of opportunities opens up more broadly. So we have to make 2021 a year in which we zero on the risk of that accordion opening. And yes, I am optimistic. I think that I actually agree with Michael that this crisis showed to us we are interconnected. We are as strong as the weakest link. And I do believe that you would see next year more global cooperation and more attention domestically, as we heard from the minister, on the right policies to make economies stronger. But it is a book that is not yet written. And it is a book that each one of us has responsibility to hold the pen and do it right. I was listening to Michael thinking, when you talk about K-shape, thinking of The Tale of Two Cities, Dickens' book. Well, you have The Tale of Two Cities, you have discontent. So in everybody's interest for us to cooperate, and I take it as my responsibility from the IMF to build that cooperative spirit, to drive this commitment to building resilience, building forward, not building back, building forward with an eye on the developing world is a world of opportunity. This is where the growth potential is. This is where the young people are. Equip them with what they need to perform for them and for the rest of us.
Thank you, MD. We've got about 8 minutes left, so I want to go through everyone again with some closing remarks and just a final question. Nyananzai, I spend so much time in the informal sector, and I've been looking at the impact it's had on one of the most important drivers of economic activity on the continent, and perhaps one of the most largely ignored and the most vulnerable. I wonder what you think the future is going to be for the women that are selling eggs on the side of the road and the men that are fixing the shoes. And I think about these people because these people actually are honestly so important in the greater scheme of things. So Nyaranzai, I'd love for you to weigh in here and some closing remarks for me.
Thank you so much. We are not a statistic, neither are we a footnote to a report nor a photo. As African women and our children, we are real, we are innovative, we are creative, we have solutions. And what we need is the vaccine. We need the vaccine to everybody so that the women on the market can continue to sell, knowing that they are healthy. Currently, we are worried about the nationalistic approach that is there with the vaccine. The market women cannot go to the market if they are not healthy, if they are not well, if they are at risk. We need that vaccine just as much as everybody else needs that vaccine. We need fiscal space for our governments and our governments to negotiate not only through the executive, but with an accountability to the people. We need greater role of parliaments for oversight. We need greater role of plugging the leakages in our economy, tax evasions, corruption, illicit financial flows outside the country. Africa is rich. Africa is filthy rich. It's a question of decisions, and it's a question of choice. It's a question of options, and it's a question of implementing the continental instruments that we have. Definitely, we look forward to a stronger reformed IFIs that continue to put people at the center. And indeed, with climate justice as a driving force. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my sister. Mr. Kramer, so there's two questions. What do you ask, an economist when you have him on a panel? I guess for me is like, are we heading to a debt crisis, and are you worried? And number two, just on the vaccines, because I think this is really important. Aspen is a South African pharmaceutical company that has now signed a deal with Johnson & Johnson to produce vaccines on the continent for the very first time. And we're talking about distribution and access here. And I know the MD, before we started, we were talking about generics. How do you see that playing out as a scenario? So there's two scenarios for me, if you could comment, please.
Right. Countries have taken big hits, and first on the debt issue, and some countries are getting into debt problems. And as the managing director said, in some cases, this will be just a matter of restructuring the timing of payments. In other cases, there may be need to address some of the deeper issues. I take the minister's point that different countries will have different needs, and it makes sense to address this on a case-by-case basis. On the issue of access to vaccines and I think one thing that we've seen in this crisis is there's many different approaches to vaccines. Some companies are pricing at very different levels. Partly that's because different technologies are involved, but also different companies have made different decisions. So some have said, we're going to do this on a nonprofit basis, and we're going to make arrangements for this to be produced internationally. So, for example, Serum, you cited one example. Another example is Serum Institute of India is producing basically the AstraZeneca vaccine under license, and they'll be selling at $3 a dose. So compare that to $20 a dose in other cases. We're a friend of mine who's a vaccine expert. You're asking me as an economist, but a friend of mine who's a vaccine expert said, people were asking him, which vaccine should he take or should I take? And he said, take the first one that's available. And I think that's really true. I've actually done some calculations with epidemiologists on this. Trying to figure out really, this is a situation where you get the vaccine a few months earlier, you're protected those few months. So rather than try to say, which is the ideal vaccine to take, whatever vaccine you can get, you should try to use. Now, I think the expansion of production at low prices is really vital here. And luckily, we've seen that a number of deals that allow that. And I hope that will allow increased access. But we need still.
Thank you. Honourable Minister, quite a few African countries have not signed up to COVAX. It's a big issue in terms of whether African nations have been able to place orders and make payments. Do you think that this is going to be an important one to watch? And where does Senegal stand right now?
It's going to be very important to watch. I believe we have not decided yet, which vaccine that we will be taking. I know internationally we have had some discussions, in particular President Macky Sall, with the various partners to see how to mobilize the resources so that Africa can have the vaccines also at the right cost and virtually, if possible, at the same time than the other developed countries, even if that's a challenging situation. That's why for us in Senegal at least, and I think in many countries, we are trying to be again more disciplined as well in terms of respecting the barrier gestures. We managed to bring down the number of cases drastically from a peak of almost 200 to 5 cases per day. But we are seeing recently an increase again of cases, and we are taking tough measures in terms of obliging people to put the mask and to respect the barrier gestures. Whenever we did that, we managed to really resolve the situation. But we have to plan for the vaccines. But before I conclude really, Eleni, I wanted to emphasize one particular point. The MD mentioned it, mobilizing new resources for Africa to still face the pandemic, but also the recovery. And I want to emphasize the need of the new issuance of SDRs, like it was done in 2009, but this time $500 billion, I think, but with a voluntary reallocation of idle SDRs from the G20 countries to the most vulnerable countries, in particular in Africa. And that will help us get new resources without taking on new debt. Because so far we've been taking on new debt. But with the SDRs, it's almost kind of free money, and G20 countries have a lot of it. If there is a new allocation, they will take again maybe 90% of it, and they don't need it. It's idle. How can we move it to the countries that need it without therefore increasing the level of debt? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. And literally that was what I wanted to ask the MD, because we see so much resources. We've got resources, global resources are available. How do we mobilize them? How do we get that money flowing into low-income countries and developing economies? MD, over to you.
Well, in March this year, I actually called for that leaning forward with SDRs. Meanwhile, we have mobilized SDRs from advanced economies to transfer them as concessional financing. This is how we managed to triple concessional financing and deliver this year. And certainly this is one avenue we have to continue to explore and pursue, work with the membership so it can be done, because there is a financial gap to be filled. We put a price tag on it for Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa 2023, 290 billion financial gap. If we are serious about meeting the SDGs, if we are serious about growth. So gap to be filled in a way that is cooperative and creative. And I want to thank the Minister for recognizing that there are still tools we haven't used, and we have to fill this gap. Everything has to be on the table, and we need to move with all the capacity we have. There will be a financing for Africa meeting in Paris in the spring. President Macron called for it. We actually have been mobilizing with Africa a series of meetings, and it would be a very good moment for us to stand up and be counted. I will be there and I will stand up.
Thank you, MD. What an honor to hear you speak. Thank you for your insights. Thank you, Honourable Minister. Thank you so much, Nzai. And thank you, Mr. Kramer. It has been incredible. I hope to see you in person soon. I want to be back in Dakar, Minister. I was there last year, as I said. I want to be back traveling across Africa again, telling the stories that matter, and of course, following the MD as well as she makes waves and changes the way the institution is run. I am so grateful to all of you. Thank you so very much.
Looking forward to welcoming you to Senegal. All. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
They were technical team taking over. Thank you so much to all of you for watching.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't know what to do. I was just trying to like stay smiling. Thanks, guys. Sorry I went over. I hope that's okay. You know what? I'm just shaking up the IMF rigid kind of like seriousness, by just going over the time.